Okay, welcome back, neurofeedback experts, to our monthly coaching workshop. I unfortunately have hurt my eye, so it's out of commission here, but I'm wearing my glasses and I'm just going to push through, and hopefully I'll be back into business in full shape next month. But this is one of my favorite topics to talk about, not because I love the fact that people have addictions, but I love the fact that it's completely a brain-based disorder that we as neurofeedback practitioners have the power to, first of all, treat very successfully, but secondly, prevent. And that is going to be the larger message out of the two throughout this really awesome PowerPoint. So we're going to talk about how addiction hijacks the brain quickly, and then we're going to talk about how to prevent and break that cycle. But why should you care? As a neurofeedback practitioner, if you don't specialize in addictions, why should you care? I'm going to tell you. It is because right now during COVID-19, these are all the studies that support the notion that anything that has the ability to become an addiction is through the roof right now. So in one study, they talk about addictions or the underlying substances and behaviors that can create an addiction is one nasty storm. And then now, quarantine and pandemic is another nasty storm. So basically, we have the collision of two storms right now that is going to put the world and people in the world in a really ugly place when we emerge from this time, unless we get to work at helping people. So what are we talking about? We're talking about alcohol use, which I know is being normalized, and I saw one t-shirt. Honestly, I wanted to get it because I thought it was funny, but I'm like, no way, man, I'm not buying into this. It said liquor, and then it said noun, what has gotten me through 2020. Funny, right? And if you know me, if you've seen my Instagram, you know I like t-shirts that say funny things. But it's not funny because that is true. Liquor sales, alcohol sales are through the roof, and people are just drinking more than ever. Pornography use is up. And if you read this study, it will show you, actually, I don't know if it's that one, but it will show you that it's anywhere between 11% and 35% through the roof. And some of these pornography sites have made themselves more available in all countries across the world. And pornography right now is one of the number one things that's becoming addictive because of the reasons I'm going to show you in just a few minutes. Internet gaming for children. So we are not just talking about adults here either. We're talking about kids, people, families. This has wide-reaching implications. This is important stuff. Substance use is up, in online gambling. Shopping's up, but that again is super normalized also, so it's hard to measure. But here's studies that are in the works on measuring what is happening right now during COVID-19. So we know that neurofeedback systems are in addiction clinics across the world. It is a number one defense these days for addiction, and I'm going to show you why. So stay with me. Watch this video, even if you think that you don't deal with addictions. If you deal with people in your practice, you deal with brewing addictions right now, and you likely deal with addictions. You just don't know it. And why this becomes even more important, and this is what happened to me and why I'm so bent on this right now, is that some of my favorite clients, one person in particular, I could not figure out why I wasn't able to help him. And his high beta kept going up, and I'm going to show you the graphs, and I could not figure it out until I figured it out, that he was completely hooked on pornography and wasn't telling anybody, so nobody knew about it, but it was damaging his brain. And wait till you see the brain graphs when it finally came out of the darkness and light was shed upon it, and he was able to move through to free his brain from the chains of pornography, which is why I have become a certified coach for sexual addictions and for partners, because this is in my practice and I need to be able to help people. It's in your practice too. Okay, enough of my soapbox. Let's move on. So why am I talking to you about that? It's because what we're talking about here is use to misuse to abuse to addiction. And I'm going to show you the actual continuum in just a little bit. But in the short run, what I want to show you is this is a slippery slope, and all the research shows that for many people it can happen really quickly, which is why pornography is on the forefront right now because of what they call the triple A's. It's accessible, it's affordable, and it's anonymous, which makes it so dangerous. And again, people are using their phones or TVs late at night, so nobody knows about it. Accessible, affordable, anonymous makes it very dangerous, and then it can happen within days, and I'm going to show you how. Okay, so happens very quickly, super slippery slope. A person just thinks that they're going to just chill and watch porn for a half hour. Then they don't understand the mechanisms that have happened in their brain that first time. They go back for the second time. The mechanism is hardwiring in what happened the first time is being hardwired in the second time, and so on. 1, 2, 3, 4 times, and we already have the slippery slope moving from use to misuse to abuse to addiction. Okay, so these are brains looking at the functional changes between a healthy brain and an addicted brain. In the healthy brain, you can see the areas that are lit up. And I'm going to show you them on a different diagram in just a minute. But there's lots of activation in the healthy brain when this person is out enjoying their life, when they're spending time with their friends, when they're engaged in their work that they find meaningful. The healthy brain is activated for pleasure in life in the real world. What happens in the addicted brain is there is no longer that level of reward or pleasure from the things in life that should bring the level of activation that we see in the healthy brain. So this was a surprising finding for many of the researchers because they thought it would make their rewards go off the chart. Actually, what's happening is that when this person is living their life, their brain is not able to receive the activation that it would if it was healthy. The only way that it can get the activation that it needs to feel okay is to engage in the addictive behavior or use the addictive substance. So that is why it becomes so dangerous, because now the person's having dinner with their family, and let's just use pornography. You might not want to do it, but I'm going to do it anyways because it's a passion project. So let's say this person didn't watch pornography a year ago, and a year ago they're having dinner with their friends and family and they're enjoying it and their brain's healthy and activated like that. Now they've been watching pornography every night for an hour for 1 year. Now they're sitting with their friends and family and their brain has this lower level of activation. It doesn't want to be there. It is annoyed that it's there because it wants to get back to the activity that it gives the brain the pleasure that it needs. This is how the slope is slippery, and this is what actually happens. So what happens in the end is that addicted brain needs extreme amounts of stimuli to be able to get the amount of pleasure that the healthy brain gets just out in the world. What happens is there's tolerance and escalation that begins immediately, so that the brain has to get more and more and more stimuli over time to get the same level of activation that it got a week ago. So escalation in behaviors, if it's substance abuse, there's more and more consumption of alcohol, or for drugs, if it's pornography use, there's more watching, and it has to become more extreme to get the same level of pleasure that they had a month ago. So then what happens is, and this is the most mind-boggling part for most people that they don't see the connections between, is that it creates behavioral changes in the person over time. So because of this lower level of activation in the brain when the person's just living their life, they now have dissatisfaction in their life. And they do not equate it to pornography, which is why I am so passionate about it. They think that's just something they do to relax. They don't get it's changing the activation levels in their brain, so that now when they go to work and they don't want to engage in work, they just don't feel like it, they don't equate it to their habit. And it's literally being caused by it. So it's dissatisfaction on the low end, but it's depression and anxiety, anger and rage on the high end. And so that's why this is really important to add, how often do you watch pornography and for how long on intakes. And this is not something that many people are going to offer up that information, but it can't hurt to ask, because then at least if they answer, and I've added it, so more and more people are actually writing it down because they're there for big problems and they want help. So now they're writing it down. Same thing with alcohol use or drug use. We have most of that covered on our intakes, but this is what happens in the brain, and we're going to dig in just a second. But then what happens is it creates an addiction cycle that I'm going to show you. And it's characterized by hiding the behavior, which leads to shame and to lies. So the addiction pattern is able to brew underneath and get worse and worse and worse. Okay, so let's break it down. How does addiction hijack the brain? The bubbles you see above this head are listed here in the steps. Number one is the person has, if the person's living their life, first step is, in their actual life, their brain is maintaining homeostasis, meaning that if you go have a pleasurable experience, go for a walk with your dog and your spouse, and you love them and you're having a lovely evening, your brain will dump 10 milligrams of dopamine into your brain to give you the feeling of pleasure when you're having a relaxing evening with your family. Now, you go and engage in the addictive substance or behavior. We're just going to use porn because I think it's easy. That night, you go and you watch pornography. Because the stimuli is so much, higher levels of stimuli than a walk with your family, it dumps 20 milligrams of dopamine into the brain. So what happens is it rocks homeostasis. So homeostasis in the brain ceases to exist. The brain compensates. It's trying to get back to homeostasis. And so what it does, it stoppers the dopamine production. So now you went and you watched porn. We had a 20 milligram dump. Brain stoppers that to get back to homeostasis. Now the person goes back to watch porn again, the addictive behavior, and the brain dumps 20 milligrams of dopamine again. But then it's stoppering it, because it's trying to maintain homeostasis. So what happens is now the brain has to produce 40 milligrams of dopamine to be able to get the same as the first hit, the 20 milligrams, because half of it is being stoppered. That's how tolerance occurs. So in the example of pornography, you're watching it, you get the 20 milligram dump initially, now you need 40 to feel 20. And the same thing happens with alcohol. So that's why people might start with beer and alcohol, and then they ramp it up to liquor, and then they have to ramp it up to 2 drinks or 3 drinks to get the same feeling. Same thing with pornography. It might be a half hour. Now it has to be an hour, and it has to be much more extreme because the brain is trying to create homeostasis. So it's stoppering the dopamine, and that will continue on and on and on. And so what happens, especially when it comes to pornography addiction, is people start crossing moral boundaries. And in sexual addiction, people start acting out with humans because they can't get that same level of dopamine dump into their brain from watching pornography. Okay, so the cycle continues and it worsens. Behavior changes, tolerance increases, and if it's all being hidden by shame and guilt, then it is nobody knows. Nobody can step in until this person hits DEFCON. Let me show you what's happening in the brain mechanisms in the brain. And you can see the diagram here. What happens is in the ventral tegmental area, and you can see it there in blue, closest to the brainstem, and it says right on there, it's the dopamine production area. What happens is that's where that dopamine dump is happening of 20 milligrams. Then the dopamine travels through the reward pathway in the brain to the nucleus accumbens. And in the nucleus accumbens, that is the area for motivation and for goal-directed behavior. So basically there, it's locking in the memory of that feeling of the 20 milligram dump that was initially there during that coupled experience of whatever the addictive substance or behavior is, and the feeling that they got from the dopamine dump in their brain. It's being locked in by the nucleus accumbens in that area, and it remembers it, and it wants it again, and it's going to create goal-directed behavior to go get that feeling again of reward. But then it travels through that dopamine, that reward pathway travels through to the prefrontal cortex. And we know in the prefrontal cortex that that is the area for executive function. It's for judgment control. It's for inhibitory control of behaviors. That's where thinking happens. So up in the prefrontal cortex, it's now getting this reward from that addictive behavior, and it's feeling the pleasure, and it is eventually going to knock that area out to be able to make good decisions. So that's why decision making becomes impaired, because of the way that the reward pathways in the brain work. Hopefully you're with me, because I find this mind blowing. And in the end, what we need to do is and I'm going to get there in a second, but we need to identify the people who have the brain patterns that are at risk and the behaviors that are at risk for coupling these addictive patterns, so we can break them before they even start, because that's how we're going to change the world. Of course, we're going to help people if they get there, but we don't want people to get there if we can avoid it. Okay, so we're also going to talk about delta phos-B. Now, delta phos-B is a gene transcription factor in the brain, and it has been called, and I have it there in quotes, the sustained molecular switch for addiction. So it is considered now the biomarker for addiction. If in the nucleus accumbens we see that there's overactivity, it's switched on and it stays on, of the delta phos-B gene transcription factor. So what it is it's a critical component in the development of virtually all forms of behavioral and drug addictions, because this is something that happens. And what happens is it becomes overly expressed. It's turned on. That switch is turned on, and it triggers transcription events in the brain that produce a chronic addictive state. Now, what does that mean? A chronic addictive state means that that person's brain needs what I just explained about getting that dopamine surge in their brain. The brain is always in the state that it is looking for the dopamine surges to create the activation that it used to be able to get in its regular life. That's the chronic addictive state. It's that low activation brain looking for higher levels of activation, and it's basically stuck in that mode because of delta phos-B. So what that does is it creates a compulsive reward-seeking behavior on the part of the person for that particular stimulus. So for example, when people get hooked on pornography, they will need to continue to watch it. So when it becomes pervasive for people, not only are they watching it late at night when they get home, then it's mostly men. So I'm sorry, men, if you're out there, because I will just say he to make it easier. But then what happens is if a man's watched pornography and his brain is now in this chronic addictive state and he gets to work, he finds that he has to watch it for 5 or 10 minutes. Why? Because his brain doesn't have the level of activation that it used to. So he needs to get a little dopamine surge to be able to get through his workday. And then he has to watch it at lunch, because if not, his brain is just cooked. It's not able to move through the afternoon to be able to get his life done. He needs a dopamine surge because the activation now is lower in the reward center, meaning that brain doesn't want to go do life because it doesn't get enough of a reward. All it wants to do is get back to the addictive habit. And that can happen with gambling and with shopping and with eating and with drinking and with drugs. It just depends what it gets mapped onto in the first place. And we'll talk about why that happens in just a second. So how does this happen? It happens through increased sensitivity due to more dendritic spines. And there's a picture there and a reference of the study that I took it from down below, Nestler et al., 2001. So, and this is an example with drug exposure, but when there's repeated drug exposure, the normal response is on the left. On the right, when there's delta phos-B, there's more spines that are created. So that brain is looking for that substance because it has created more dendritic spines over time that become highly sensitive to that one thing, that one substance or that one behavior. So what it does is ultimately it creates a dependence on that behavior or on that substance. So in the end, it creates long-term sensitivity over time so that even after abstinence, it's difficult for the brain to be able to exist in that mode. And it's due to this higher level of sensitivity. Okay, so let's look at the cycle here and looking at how it unfolds over time. So what happens initially is, and we're going to get to this on the next slide, is that we know from all of the research that pain and stress in childhood, trauma, has been linked to the creation of this cycle over time. So who is most susceptible for addiction? There is, and we call it genetic, but really I think of genetic as a brain-based pattern that is being carried down generation from generation. So I like to think of it as familial, even though we know with this delta phos-B that there is genes involved. So what happens is in early childhood, there's trauma, and that can either be severe trauma like sexual abuse or physical abuse, verbal abuse. It can be neglect. It can be just a dysfunctional family, that things were very dysfunctional and it created a traumatic response in that child's brain. But we know that trauma in childhood has been linked to being more likely to fall into addiction. So then what happens is the delta phos-B in that brain is triggered much earlier on in life, because we also know there's a study that shows that delta phos-B is more highly activated in pain and stress. So they go together. Delta phos-B is activated. Then what happens is the neurotransmitter released through the pathways in the reward system, like we just looked at. Then it's locked into memory and motivation and goal-directed behavior that is forcing it back towards that behavior. Then there's perpetuation of the cycle. And this can happen even without the behaviors. So when we get to the ending slides, where I'm going to show you that neurofeedback's highly effective for, first of all, treating addiction, and secondly, for creating abstinence long term, which is super important. The reason that's super important is because we know that the delta phos-B doesn't turn back off. And it can, but it's tricky for that delta phos-B to turn itself off, and that's the dry drunk concept, if you've heard of that. Meaning that the brain hasn't changed, but a person is in abstinence, but their brain is still stuck in that chronic addictive state. And so, unfortunately, in some circles, honestly, I don't buy it, because I think neuroplasticity works across our lifetime if we work it hard enough. But the idea is, if you just stop drinking or if you stop watching pornography, your brain actually isn't going to change unless you do something to change it, because it is stuck in this mode. So that's why they call people dry drunks, because even when people abstain from drinking, if they haven't done the work to change their brain back to that healthy activation level, it will stay in that same pattern that creates the craving and the longing. So let's look at the addiction cycle, and this is why it becomes so easy to relapse and so difficult to break the cycle unless you change the person's brain performance pattern. So there's internal frustration, which leads to the person fantasizing and thinking about the release that they're going to get once they get the substance or the behavior that they're longing. Then they start obsessing about that. And we know from research on addictions that the fantasizing and the obsessing can start to create that dopamine surge that the person is looking for even before they act out. And that is a really strong part of this cycle. Then they use the substance or they engage in the behavior, which then gives them another dopamine surge. And then many times they go overboard with that. And we know what it creates is, with that dopamine surge in the brain, it creates, it takes my favorite concept ever of flow from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and I'm sure you've heard me talk about it in other videos. It takes that concept and it just ruins it for me, which is one thing that I don't like about addiction. But the idea is, when we are engaged, you've probably heard me say before, when we're engaged in work we love or we're helping people that we love, we lose time because our brain is just so in the flow of SMR and low beta and alpha. We're just in the zone in the middle. There's no high beta associated with it. There's no theta. We could do our work for hours. And if you've ever done that, where you've just got sucked into a project and you look up and it's 5 hours later and you're like, whoa, where'd the time go? Because you were enjoying that rhythm and hum of the zone. That is the healthy way to do it with our work. Unfortunately, in the addiction cycle, that's what the loss of control is. That person's brain gets into the flow and it's using alpha and SMR and low beta, and it's decreasing high beta and it's decreasing theta and delta, but all artificially and and very harmfully for the person. But that is what makes them come back for it. That's what the dopamine surge does to the EEG. So that's why it's so tricky to break that. That's what we have to break. The longing for that, and we have to get the brain back to healthy activation levels, because there's actually nothing in life that can create this huge dump of dopamine in the first place, unless the person's into extreme sports and things like that, which even that might not give you the levels that a person gets from an addictive cycle. Okay, so after they use, people will be in a numbed out, zoned out feeling for hours or days sometimes, because their brain has just gotten that dopamine surge that they've wanted so badly. But then when they come down from that, there's guilt over use of the substance or the behavior, and this starts the shame cycle. So then they stop using for a while, and sometimes there's a purge. In some cycle wheels that you look at, they'll call it the purge, where the person will try to get help again if they know they're stuck in this cycle and they've been going through it over and over and over. Some people will reach out for help them, but then time passes and the internal frustration begins again and the cycle begins again. So what's important for me to have you to know is that during each one of these pieces of this cycle, the person's behavior changes. So internal frustration, you might see the addict acting out and being stressed out and ragey and angry and dissatisfied, nothing feeling good to them. Once they start fantasizing and obsessing, then it's called overly bright. The person might be overly bright and now they're in a great mood. So on Monday they were in a bad mood. Tuesday they're in a great mood. Why are they in a great mood? Because their brain knows that the relief is coming, because they plan on acting out. Then they act out and they're numbed out and zoned out, and they may not even be around people during that period. Then they feel guilty. And on the guilt end, what a lot of addicts do is they will do nice things for the people in their world because they feel guilty and they have shame inside. So an addict might buy his wife flowers because he knows he's acted out, even though he's told her he wouldn't do it. So now he's compensating for that, and then he stops using for a while and the cycle begins again. And this is a nasty, nasty cycle, but the person's behavior will shift. So it shows up in the person's world. So if someone reports that their behavior's all over the map, there could be something underneath it that is a full-blown addiction or an addiction brewing. Especially if that's a new behavior, you want to investigate that and stop it in its tracks. Okay, so how does the addiction cycle relate to EEG? Let's just get right into it. So this has been corroborated by science, is that ADHD and addictions are linked. Anxiety and addictions are linked. So what that means is too much use of theta makes it so the brain needs more stimulation. Theta's slow speed, the brain is shutting down. It is seeking more stimulation in the first place. Then, if a person has anxiety, that brain is seeking calming. It needs to be calmed down because it's running fast with all that high beta. And then we know, and if you've watched my workshop on ADHD and anxiety, you know that ADHD and anxiety are comorbid. So if a person's brain is performing out here in the extremes of high beta and theta, they need stimulation and calming simultaneously, which is what they will get from their addiction. At the same time, there's a trauma pattern to it. Trauma is a low power pattern in the brain. So if you see low power with excessive theta and excessive high beta, your patient or client might be at risk for a brewing addiction, especially during COVID-19. Okay, so let's think about the stages of addiction. It's on a continuum. And this is important if we're going to try to stop it in its tracks, is the continuum is social use or occasional use of the behavior or the substance. So if you drink every once in a while and it's socially, then that's not a problem. Then it becomes regular use. So if you start drinking every day at home, then that is moving in the wrong direction, obviously. Then there's problematic use or abuse, which means every day at home you're having 3 or 4 drinks. Then there's addiction and dependency, which means you can't go a day or two without having one, or your brain will move into withdrawal. And we know during withdrawal that the activation of the delta phos-B is increased, which makes the person want to get back to the addiction. Now we know from addictions too, from the science, that that the behavior starts as impulsive. So it's a person just impulsively doing the thing, but then it becomes compulsive, where they have to. There's the draw to go back. So at first it's not planned, and it's not that the nervous system needs to go back to it. In the end, it ends up becoming that way. So the way that it works is the first time the person watches pornography or has a drink for pleasure. So in an impulsive situation, you're doing the thing so to seek out pleasure. In the end, when it becomes compulsive, it's to avoid pain. It actually, in the end, generally doesn't bring the person pleasure anymore. It brings activation of the brain, which is the reward for the brain, but it's to escape pain. So that is the difference in the continuum, moving from social use, which would be impulsive or just you feel like you want to do it for a little bit of pleasure, to, in the end, addiction or dependency is compulsive. You have to do that, and it's to avoid the pain of reality or how your brain feels when it's just functioning without the addictive substance or behavior. And there's three main stages in that: preoccupation and anticipation in addiction. So we've already talked about this. This can give the dump into the brain of the dopamine surge. Then there's the binge or the intoxication. Again, you get another dopamine surge, and then withdrawal or the negative effect. And that is the opposite. It creates the longing, intense longing for the dopamine surge. Okay, hopefully you're with me and we are moving right along. I wanted to show you this because we just looked at the addiction cycle, and I know many of you are into nutrition and food. This is happening with food too. The person's stressed out, they feel it in their brain, their nervous system goes on overdrive, that's high beta, hormones are released, cortisol, then there's poor metabolism, which makes them seek out junk food and sugar, and we know chocolate is addictive, and sugar is more addictive than cocaine in studies of rats, which is mind-boggling. But then about half the carbs get stored as fat. Then there's cravings and hunger, reward development, memory, and then learned addiction behavior and memory. It's the same cycle for food. So if you are working with someone who is obese and is struggling with obesity, there could be an addictive cycle that goes back to their brain. That is what I want you to know. Okay, so let's think about quickly the characterization. And I paused and I kept it for now. I normally put it first because I wanted you to know this applies to you as a neurofeedback practitioner, even if you're not an addiction specialist. But it is a brain disorder that's characterized by compulsive engagement in rewarding stimuli despite adverse consequences. So usually what that means is the person keeps doing it even though their relationships are breaking down. There might be financial difficulties that come out of it. Some people get arrested and go to jail, and then they continue to do the same behavior. That is what addiction is. You keep going back for more, even though it's creating problems in your life. Delta FOSS-B, we know, is increased in those with chronic pain and stress. So if you have someone who has chronic pain and stress, it is likely that their switch is turned on, which puts them at higher risk for addiction, and that definitely has to do with trauma in childhood. We know that there's a cascading effect of neurotransmitters like I just showed you, but we also know that it is not caused by psychosocial factors, but they contribute. So, and I like people to know this because we think of addiction being related to depression and anxiety, which means it's related to psychological factors, but those psychological factors don't cause addiction. The brain does, the brain mechanisms that I just showed you. And in all the research, it calls addictions a brain disorder, which is why it is served by neurofeedback. But you can see, and this is from Erik Erikson's Stages of Psychosocial Development, that in the early years, in infancy, children have to learn how to trust their family. If that trust can't be built, then there's a breakdown, and that puts them at risk for addiction. Autonomy and shame and doubt, many people who form addictions in those early years have shame and doubt. They are shamed by their teachers, their preachers, their parents. All the people who should be bumping them up are shaming them and creating doubt, not autonomy, which then also creates guilt, industry versus inferiority, It's really a shame cycle is what it is. Identity versus role confusion. So in the teenage years when kids are figuring themselves out and becoming themselves, if they're told that that version of themselves isn't the right one, then their psychosocial development can suffer. Intimacy versus isolation. As we get to middle age, like I'm in, thinking about generational legacy or stagnation. So if in middle age a person is still happy with their life and they're producing and creating things that they love, they will not suffer from stagnation and feeling like it doesn't matter. And in the end, when they're older, it's either integrity, they feel like their life was worthwhile, or despair because they feel like it was wasted. And so there's addictions that are created in the aging also. And we know that it is associated with Alzheimer's. So as people get older, if they feel this despair, they can then kind of go backwards into addiction. Okay, so it's control in the brain. So what's happening in the brain, despite or in combination with what I've already showed you? There's two types of control in the brain. There's cognitive control and stimulus control, and those are opposite processes. So basically, cognitive control is internal control. It's the thinking and the judgment. External control is stimulus control. It's a stimulus that is so exciting and has the hope of providing the reward that it makes that person go for the stimulus. So when a person is able to inhibit doing a behavior because they know it's not good for them, their cognitive control is intact. When their cognitive control is impaired, then that can lead to addictions. And science shows that cognitive control internally is impaired in ADHD and addiction. And that's the link there. And it comes out of too much use of theta in the frontal lobe, typically. Okay, hopefully you're following me and connecting all these slides because they all connect, which I think is so cool about it. Stimulus control is a stimulus-driven behavioral response. So a person has to act out because of an external reward. So it's associated with a particular rewarding stimulus that tends to dominate one's behavior. So a person's behavior keeps going back to that behavior or that substance in the addiction. So how do we break the cycle? This is when we get to neurofeedback. This is and I'm going to show you the study on one of the last slides, but there is a powerful study that shows that neurofeedback is very powerful for addictions. And how we break the cycle is we first inhibit high beta, if high beta is there, and you need to judge it and base it upon a person's brain map. Bring high beta down to chill that brain out. Then if theta is high too, we need to inhibit theta at the same time. Then we need to bring beta up on the left and SMR up on the right. And what this study did is that there were two sensors, and they were used on the left between the frontal and C3, so basically here in the FZ area. Then we also had sensors over at C4 and PZ, between C4 and PZ, and increasing SMR on the right and increasing beta on the left to balance that asymmetry while inhibiting high beta and theta if it was too high. Then, after a number of sessions, when we see that pattern is regulating, then being able to have alpha theta training where we dangle alpha and theta near each other to unlock the trauma that's in that person's brain so they can dig in and the brain is freed from that. So that is the 3 protocols that are shown to be successful for people with addictions. And I'm going to show you the graphs from that study in just a few minutes. Okay, so let's look at a couple neurofeedback trends from my favorite client that I was talking about. This is session number 7 from January 13th, 2019. The green line is high beta on this graph, and what we see here is high beta in terms of relative power is dominating over low beta and over theta. High beta is the highest, and here it's 2 microvolts, which equates really to about 12 microvolts on most people's systems. So we see 12 microvolts of high beta, so it's high absolute power and high in relative power. It's trouncing theta and low beta. Session number 1. This is my concern, or session number 7. Session number 12. now high beta's up at 4. It's gone up 2 points, and theta's still up there high, and low beta, everything's overactive. And so this is a person who, tells me that there's nothing going on except for their high beta's going up, and not only that, it's off the charts. So then, session 13, this is the beginning of recovery for this person. This is when the cat was out of the bag regarding pornography use. And in the interim, the last session 12 was in January. This is in March. And look at the high beta reduction that happened. And now high beta is down at 0.6 because that brain was holding on to all of that high beta, trying to abstain and failing and going through that addiction cycle. Theta's still high, and so it trains down beautifully during this session. And these are short little rounds in the session, but trains down beautifully. High beta moving in a nice downward trend. And then the changes that occurred. Oh, and this isn't during relapse. This is changes that occurred over time. And I labeled it wrong because I was going to put a relapse in and I didn't. So I'm sorry that's labeled wrong, but this is over time. This is session 43 from recently, and you can see high beta's nice and low, theta's even lower, and low beta's up above high beta, and theta's above low beta, just where we want them to be. That is not a relapse. This is over time, the success over time. Okay, so showing you what that looks like is you can see on this graph of sessions over time that high beta's off the charts at these beginning sessions, and it's in the 2 range, then it's up in the 4 range, and then that break point here where it comes down in March, and it's been down ever since. Now, this is the amazing thing about neurofeedback, is that this person's partner was also doing neurofeedback at the same time, and look what happens in the partner's brain. Theta's off the charts because it's overwhelmed. High beta's up there, and the whole brain is showing overactivity because this person's partner does not know how to help them with their addiction. Finally, there's a breaking point in March, and both of their brains are able to come down and stay down. So it's truly amazing how neurofeedback helps, but there has to be recovery in abstinence and addiction also. So let's look at this graph that shows the study by Scott et al. Showed that neurofeedback recovery is 77% effective when neurofeedback is included, compared to 44% when neurofeedback is not included. And you can see the chart there. There's the experimental and the control, and the experimental shows that over time that the brain was able to come down and be able to get out of that addictive cycle. Then looking at the long-term gains, there's 12-month abstinence in the data. So you can see that in the experimental group, there's much higher levels of people who were successful at maintaining abstinence, and this is alcohol use, opposed to the control group was much lower. More people left the study when they weren't using neurofeedback. More people relapsed, and more people didn't have contact. And the experimental group with neurofeedback has the highest levels for success. Totally, totally awesome. Okay, so in summary, neurofeedback's powerful if you work with addictions. If you don't, you want to look for those brain patterns that could be at the precipice of this slippery slope of addiction and help decrease high beta and decrease theta, bump up beta and SMR so that the person's brain gets the levels of activation that it needs from its life so that person can be happy in their life and not need to seek out behaviors or substances that can lead to addiction. Okay, I hope this helps you out. And as always, you can go to my website at drtrishleigh.com. I have new services. We are offering neurofeedback experts direct. In the new year, we are working with just a few clinics right now where we provide home neurofeedback for your patients for you as a consulting service, and you keep half the money and you don't do anything. I keep the other half and I do everything. It's a way to try to get my outreach out there even more and make it easier for you to be able to provide home neurofeedback. The graphs you saw in this monthly coaching are from my home neurofeedback online program that I'm happy to offer for you to your patients. They remain your patients. They are not mine. Then we also have our monthly coaching, which you're in. And now I'm reading brain maps and trend screens for people. A lot of people taking me up on it. I make you a video. You can convert your patients much more easily. You can keep them in care because you know what to say to them, because you know what their map means for them, and you know if they're improving based on their trend screens. Okay, sorry about the eye, and hope to be in one piece next month. As always, thank you for joining me, and if you have any thoughts or questions, reach out to me at info@drtrishleigh.com. Thanks.